On May 7, 2025, inside a quiet Texas courtroom, a case that had been dragging on for 4 years finally reached a turning point. There was no jury selection, no opening statements, no weeks of testimony. Kevin Ware Jr. simply stood before the judge and said 2 words: guilty. Guilty to the murder of Taylor Pomaski. Guilty to tampering with her remains. 2 days later, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For Taylor's family, it was a moment they'd been waiting for since 2021. A sense of accountability, a sense of finality, a certainty that the man who took her life would never have the chance to hurt someone else. But the plea also left a lot unsaid. There would be no trial, no full reconstruction of that night, no detailed testimony about how it happened or how far things went before they ended. Much of the truth would remain locked behind one man's silence. Because when Taylor Pomaski died, it didn't make immediate sense. She didn't vanish on a highway, she didn't disappear on a trip. There wasn't a frantic 911 call. Her last moments looked ordinary. A house, a small gathering, music in the background, people talking. The kind of night nobody expects to remember until someone never comes home. On April 25, 2021, 29-year-old Taylor Pomaski was at a house party in Spring, Texas. Witnesses later described a heated, violent argument between her and the man she was living with. After that night, Taylor was never seen again. Days turned into weeks. Her phone went unanswered. Her family heard nothing. The space she should have been occupying began to feel empty in a way that scared everyone. For months, there were no answers. No confirmed crime scene, no body, no explanation. Just a growing fear that whatever happened wasn't meant to be seen. This is the story of what happened to Taylor Pomaski. The investigation that slowly uncovered the truth, the evidence that built piece by piece over 4 years, and the quiet courtroom moment that finally closed it. Because sometimes the most disturbing cases don't start with a crime. They start with something ordinary, a party, an argument, a disappearance, and a night that never really ended. Before she became a headline, before her name filled police reports, Taylor Pomaski was just Taylor. She was 29. Friends describe her as warm, outgoing, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make it feel lighter. She laughed easily, she cared deeply, and if someone needed help, she was the first to step in. To her family, she was more than a daughter or a sister. She was a steady presence, a check-in call, a reason to smile on a regular day. Later, when they spoke in court about her, they didn't focus on how her life ended. They talked about her heart, her kindness, her loyalty, the way she put others first. In the end, they called her a hero, not for what happened to her, but because the fight for justice meant the man responsible would never have the chance to hurt another woman. But in the spring of 2021, Taylor's life was complicated. Like many people, she was figuring things out. Relationships, stability, the kind of uncertainty that comes when life isn't turning out the way you expect. At that time, she was living in Spring, Texas with former NFL player Kevin Ware Jr. From the outside, it might have looked like an ordinary relationship, but people close to them would later describe tension, arguments, conflict, moments that hinted things weren't stable. Still, there was nothing to suggest what was about to happen. No police report could have predicted it. No single moment marked a clear point of no return. Just a slow build, a relationship witnesses would later describe as volatile. Then came April 2021. 5 days before Taylor went missing, Kevin Ware was arrested after a high-speed chase. Investigators said he'd been driving over 115 miles per hour. Inside his vehicle, officers found a loaded AK-47, a 9mm pistol, and large amounts of cocaine, meth, and marijuana. He was released on a $23,000 bond. Life, on the surface, seemed to continue. But that arrest added another layer of instability. One investigators would look at closely when piecing together the days leading up to Taylor's disappearance. Because in cases like this, the last night doesn't exist in isolation. There are usually warning signs, moments that looking back feel heavier than they did at the time. And just days after the arrest, on April 25, 2021, Taylor Pomaski went to a house party. It would be the last time anyone saw her alive. The night started like any other spring evening in the Houston area. Warm air, open doors, people moving in and out of a home in Spring, Texas. Inside the house, a small gathering was going on. Nothing unusual. Friends talking, music playing. The kind of night that's meant to pass without incident. Taylor Pomaski was there, so was Kevin Ware Jr. At some point, things shifted. Witnesses later told investigators that an argument broke out between the two. It wasn't quiet, it wasn't brief. People described it as serious and physical. Voices were raised, tension filled the room. The kind of confrontation that makes everyone else uncomfortable. The kind where people don't know whether to step in or just look away. What the argument was about exactly? That's unclear. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was escalating. And then, sometime after that confrontation, Taylor Pomaski disappeared. No one saw her leave. No one could say for sure when she was last alive. There was no goodbye, no desperate phone call, no message letting anyone know where she was going. She was just gone. At first, it didn't set off immediate alarm. Parties end, people leave quietly, plans change. But as the hours stretched into days, something felt wrong. Her phone stopped getting activity. Calls went unanswered. No messages. And for those who knew her best, the silence didn't make sense. Taylor wasn't the type to disappear without telling anyone. The last confirmed place she had been, that house. After a violent argument with the man she was living with. The hours after that night would later become the hardest to piece together. Because whatever happened next, no one came forward. No one saw her leave. No one knew where she went. And soon, the question that would drive the investigation became clear. If Taylor never left that house, what happened to her inside it? In the first hours after the party, it still wasn't obvious something was seriously wrong. People leave gatherings quietly, phones die, plans shift, but Taylor's family felt something was off almost immediately. Days passed, then more days. No calls, no messages, no social media posts, no explanations. That silence didn't fit. Taylor stayed in touch with the people she loved. She checked in, she showed up. She didn't just vanish. By the end of the first week, concern turned into fear. Mother's Day was coming, and still, nothing. On May 10, 2021, her family made it official. They filed a missing persons report. What had been worry became an investigation. Detectives started retracing Taylor's last known movements. Where had she been seen? Who was she with? When was the last confirmed contact? Everything pointed back to one place, the house party on April 25th, and to one person, Kevin Ware Jr. Investigators interviewed the people who had been there. Most described the same thing, a serious, violent argument between Taylor and Ware. It was the last confirmed event before she disappeared. As the search expanded, investigators looked closely at Ware's actions in the days that followed. One thing stood out. While friends, family, and volunteers were searching for Taylor, Ware didn't help. He refused to join organized searches. He didn't help spread information. He didn't actively look for the woman he had been living with. Weeks later, his legal situation changed again. On June 11, 2021, U.S. Marshals arrested Ware for violating bond conditions from his earlier drug and weapons case. He had missed court appearances and failed to check in. He was back in custody. Meanwhile, the search for Taylor kept going. Weeks became months. Teams combed wooded areas, empty lots, and remote land across North Harris County. Texas EquiSearch joined, following tips and leads, focusing on areas investigators believed were important. But as summer turned to fall and fall toward winter, there were still no answers. No confirmed sightings, no trace of her belongings, no clue where she had gone after that night. For her family, the uncertainty was a constant weight. Every phone call brought hope, every lead brought fear. Because the longer someone is missing, the harder it is to believe they're still out there. By December 2021, nearly 8 months after she was last seen, the search finally led investigators to something that would change the case. By then, Taylor had been missing across seasons. Leads had been followed, areas searched, tips evaluated, but there had been no physical evidence. Until information came in pointing to a remote area in North Harris County. It wasn't a place someone would stumble upon by accident. Isolated, overgrown, quiet. Search teams moved in carefully, working with the Harris County Sheriff's Office. Texas EquiSearch joined, focusing on a specific spot that leads had pointed to. On December 9th and 10th, 2021, they found something. Human remains. The recovery was slow and methodical. By that point, the remains were skeletal. there were no immediate answers, no instant confirmation, no closure. For Taylor's family, the discovery brought a mix of emotions, a small hope that maybe the uncertainty could finally end, and fear about what the truth might actually mean. The remains were taken to the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences for examination and identification. It would take months. Investigators used skeletal analysis, forensic comparisons, and scientific testing to determine whether the remains belonged to the woman who had disappeared the previous spring. Then, on April 29, 2022, the results came back. The remains were confirmed to be Taylor Pomaski. The missing person case was over. This was now a homicide investigation, and the condition of the remains told investigators something else. This wasn't an accident. Court records would later show the extent of what investigators believed had happened. Taylor had been strangled. She had injuries from a sharp object, including a cut to her throat. She had also been struck with a blunt object. And after her death, evidence indicated her body had been burned, then transported, then dumped in the remote ditch where it was eventually found. The discovery changed the investigation completely. Detectives were no longer trying to find her. They were trying to reconstruct her final hours, piece together what happened after the argument at the party, and most importantly, figure out who was responsible. By the time Taylor's remains were identified, investigators were already focused on one person. New evidence, both digital and testimonial, was starting to make the case stronger. Months of work had already gone into reconstructing her last known movements. They had witness statements from the party. They had a timeline showing a violent confrontation with Kevin Ware Jr., but suspicion alone isn't enough in a homicide case. Prosecutors needed evidence, something that linked the argument to the killing and to the disposal of her body. And piece by piece, that evidence began to come together. Witness testimony became crucial. One person told investigators that Ware had shown her a photo on his phone. The image, she said, showed a fire, and according to her, Ware explained what he had burned. If true, it confirmed what forensic investigators suspected, that Taylor's body had been intentionally burned after her death. Other witnesses described the altercation at the April 25th house party as violent and serious, the last confirmed interaction before she vanished. Investigators also examined Ware's behavior in the days and weeks that followed. While Taylor's family and volunteers were searching, Ware did not join. He refused to help in any organized searches. Meanwhile, his legal troubles continued. Weeks after Taylor was reported missing, U.S. Marshals arrested him for violating bond conditions from his April 2021 drug and weapons case. He had missed court dates and failed to check in. By mid-2021, he was back in custody. As forensic work and witness statements came together, prosecutors presented the case to a grand jury. On July 28, 2022, Kevin Ware Jr. was formally indicted. He was charged with murder and tampering with a human corpse. The charges reflected what investigators believed had happened. Taylor was killed through multiple acts of violence, and deliberate steps were taken afterward to destroy evidence and conceal her body. The case moved toward trial, but the legal process was still unfolding. Ware still faced the separate charges from the April 2021 arrest: the high-speed chase, weapons, and drugs. On December 12, 2022, he pleaded guilty to those charges and received a 15-year sentence. That sentence would later factor into the larger legal outcome. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued preparing the murder case. Witnesses were lined up, evidence organized, timelines refined. For nearly 3 years, the case progressed steadily toward a public trial. A trial that would detail every moment of Taylor Pomaski's final hours. But as the trial approached in 2025, something changed. Just days before jury selection, Kevin Ware Jr. made a choice that would bring the case to an abrupt end. By spring 2025, the case against him had been building for nearly 4 years. Prosecutors were ready, witnesses were prepared, forensic experts scheduled, evidence organized into a timeline showing Taylor's final hours and what investigators believed followed. Jury selection was scheduled for early May. For Taylor's family, the upcoming trial was something difficult, but necessary. They would hear the details, see the evidence, sit through a public reconstruction of the worst moment of their lives. But just days before it was set to begin, everything changed. On May 7, 2025, Kevin Ware Jr. accepted a plea deal. Instead of going to trial, he pleaded guilty to murder and tampering with a human corpse. That decision meant no jury, no opening statements, no cross-examinations, no public testimony laying out the full sequence of events. The trial that had taken years to prepare was over before it began. 2 days later, on May 9th, Ware was sentenced. 30 years in prison. The sentence ran at the same time as the 15-year term he had already received in 2022 for the unrelated drug and weapons charges. Legally, the case was over. There was no uncertainty about the outcome, no risk of acquittal, no appeals based on trial errors. The guilty plea ensured one thing above all: accountability. But it also left a lot unsaid. Without a trial, much of the evidence would never be made public. No detailed testimony about what happened after the house party. No full timeline described under oath. No explanation in the defendant's own words of how or why the violence happened. For Taylor's family, the plea brought certainty, but like many plea agreements, it also left silence in its wake. Because while the legal system had an answer, some of the story would never be told in a courtroom. On May 12, 2025, the court reconvened for victim impact statements. Taylor's family had waited nearly 4 years for this moment, a chance to speak directly, to make their voices heard, and to honor her memory where her life and story had been most publicly discussed. They spoke of Taylor not as a victim, but as a person. Her kindness, her loyalty, her humor, her courage. They remembered a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone who made life better for everyone around her. And in their words, a common refrain emerged. Taylor was a hero, not because she survived something unthinkable, but because her case ensured the man who took her life could never hurt another woman. The courtroom was quiet as they addressed him directly. Every word carried years of grief, frustration, and resilience. They spoke not only to acknowledge the harm done, but to affirm the truth of Taylor's life. A life full of value, not defined solely by its tragic end. It was a moment of accountability, a legal victory, but also an emotional release. The plea and sentencing had removed the uncertainty that had haunted them for years. They knew he would never walk free. And yet, some questions remained unanswered. What exactly happened inside that house the night of April 25th? Who else might have seen or known more than they realized? Which moments, which decisions, turned an argument into a violent act that ended a young life? The courtroom could deliver justice. It could not provide clarity. It could not bring Taylor back. It could only confirm that the man responsible was finally held accountable. And that, for her family, was enough. Taylor's story, her life, her presence, her impact, would not be forgotten. Her absence would be mourned. Her memory would be honored. And through her case, a cycle of violence had been stopped. Sometimes justice doesn't come as a trial. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a plea, a sentence, in the voices of those who loved the person we lost. But the night she vanished, the questions of what really happened linger. Taylor Pomaski's story is over in the legal sense. Kevin Ware Jr. is behind bars. The plea has been entered. The sentence handed down. The system has spoken. And yet, some questions remain beyond the reach of any courtroom. What happened inside that house on April 25th, 2021? When did the argument escalate? Were there moments someone could have stepped in? Could she have been saved if someone had noticed sooner? What drove Kevin Ware to commit such a violent act? Not once, but multiple times, and then try to erase every trace of it. The answers may never come. What is certain is this: Taylor Pomaski was 29 years old, loved by family, cherished by friends. Her life mattered. Her absence left a void. Her memory inspired a relentless pursuit of justice. And in the end, the man who took her life can never harm another woman. That, at least, is certain. But the night she vanished, the final moments of her life remain in shadow. The voices that could have told the story are silent. The answers exist only in court documents, witness statements, and the memories of those who loved her. Sometimes justice doesn't tell the whole story. Sometimes it only ensures the wrongdoer can no longer hurt anyone else. And sometimes we are left with questions that echo forever. We remember Taylor not for how she died, but for how she lived, for the love she gave, for the courage her story inspired. If you found this story meaningful, join our community by subscribing and turning on notifications. Every subscriber helps us continue sharing stories that matter.